Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. Russia's war economy is running out of road. It helps explain why such pressure is coming from the Kremlin via Donald Trump to find a deal that can be sold as a humiliation of Ukraine that temporarily gets Putin off the hook. Are they intent on a stable and sustainable peace? Has the Kremlin disavowed its ambitions of hegemony over Europe and initiating more wars? Absolutely not, but they need a breather to regroup, rearm, and replenish their war chest, stabilize their teetering economy and war industries, as well as reinflate the army. And Trump is dutifully obliging to try and enforce this so-called peace deal on Ukraine and Europe. Today's theme is simple and brutal, examining the impending crisis within the Russian economy, which one regime-friendly economist has said will be huge and inevitable. So these dire warnings are not coming from Western propagandists or their usual pro-Ukraine Russophobes, such as this channel, but it is a true reflection of the looming crisis according to pro-Kremlin economists, Z-patriots, state bankers, and regime-adjacent think tanks who are now openly talking about a big, inevitable crisis in 2026. This episode is built around two recent strands of work that I've watched and been impressed by. One is the Russian language analysis on the YouTube run by journalist and blogger Michael Naki, titled «Кризис будет большой и неизбежный. Экономисты в России фиксируют обвал и боятся 2026 года. The crisis will be big and inevitable. Economists in Russia register a crash and fear 2026. And the other video is Vladimir Milov's deeper work on Russia's budget crisis and war economy, plus current reporting from the Kiev Independent, Meduza, the Moscow Times, Reuters, FT, Jamestown, and others, including the Free Russia Foundation think tank. We also ask why even loyalists warning that continuing the war into 2026 is mortally dangerous economically and militarily. Well, let's cover the shift in vibe from everything's fine to a big, inevitable crisis. For most of the full-scale war, the Kremlin's economic story was sanctions. Well, they didn't work. War spending, it's great for GDP. Oil still flowing east, and the money's still flowing into our coffers. And Russia is a fortress. But in late 2025, something snapped in the information space. On one side, opposition-leaning analysts like Vladimir Milov and Igor Lipsitz are publishing long reports and interviews about a multi-year fiscal and structural crisis, persistent deficits, exhausted reserves, investment collapse, and war spending that generates no civilian value. On the other side, Z-patriots themselves are now screaming into the void. Belarusian outlet UDF summarizes a blog by Russian Z propagandist Maxim Kalashnikov, who warns that continuing the war into 2026 is mortally dangerous for Russia. He writes, "You can get an economic collapse, after which the political and military systems will fall too." Journalist Michael Naki, who closely tracks the pro-war information space, notes on his Telegram channel that Z-types are increasingly raising the alarm about problems in the Russian economy. He points out that it's not just liberal economists abroad, it also includes factory directors, agribusiness bosses, and even Z-war correspondents, all talking about bursting bubbles and looming crashes. Well, let's look at these 7 years of war deficits predicted and new war taxes. In a major report, Russia's budget crisis explained, Vladimir Milov tracks how Moscow's expectations have blown up. The Kremlin kept promising tiny deficits, 0.5 to 1% of GDP in 2024 to 2025. In reality, actual deficits have been closer to 2% of GDP or higher, and the 2025 deficit is on track to overshoot the plan again. What's new is that the government itself no longer pretends it will get back To balance, the official plan now forecasts deficits all the way through to 2028 with no surplus anywhere on the horizon. Milov underlines why this is not like Western deficits. It is not comparable to any Western economy because, firstly, Russia cannot borrow internationally. Sanctions have shut the door on that. Even China won't lend to the Russian state on the scale that is needed. Domestic borrowing is brutally expensive because of wartime interest rates. At the same time, war spending and state subsidies are carrying more of the economy, from defense factories to import substitution projects. And here is the killer quote via a pro-Kremlin banker at the Central Bank's Financial Congress. Andrei Kostin, head of state-owned VTB, said, "High military expenditures don't generate products that reach the market. They are just flying off somewhere." Well, we all know where they're flying to. They're being turned to scrap in the fields of Ukraine, and of course they have no economic value there. So how does the Kremlin plug this fiscal hole with new war taxes on its own population? In November 2025, the State Duma passed the 26 to 28 budget alongside a major tax package. VAT, the main consumption tax, will rise from 20% to 22% from 2026, expected to raise around 1 trillion rubles a year. The package also lowers the turnover threshold at which small businesses must pay VAT, dragging many more small firms into the tax net. Lawmakers approved punitive tax rates for foreign agents, 30% income tax, the kind of fiscal punishment normally reserved for non-resident foreigners, as a political weapon and a revenue grab. A separate bill introduces a new tax on imported electronics from 2026, with revenues earmarked for defense-related domestic electronics production. The Moscow Times notes that the VAT hike is explicitly aimed at closing the fiscal gap created by soaring military expenditures and falling oil and gas revenues. Then there is the banking time bomb. Pro-Kremlin economists warn of a 2026 crash. The most alarming development comes not from opposition economists, but from a Kremlin-adjacent think tank, the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, CMACP, a body close to the government, has just warned that Russia faces a systemic banking crisis by October 2026 if current trends continue. That was reported on Telegram. Their report, summarized by the Moscow Times and expert.ru, highlights non-performing loans, NPLs, have surged to 2.3 trillion rubles, about 1.6 times higher than at the start of the year. Around 1/5 of small business loans and trillions of rubles in retail loans have already been restructured. Export-oriented sectors hit by sanctions and weaker prices include metals, chemicals, fossil fuels, are all struggling to service debts. CMACP puts the probability of a systemic banking crisis by late 2026 at medium level. Now overlay that with the interest rate shock. To cool war-driven inflation, the central bank hiked its key rate up to 21%, the highest since the early 2000s. Through 2025, it has only eased down to 16.5%, with markets expecting maybe 16% by the end of the year. This is still punishingly high. The Finance Ministry now projects growth of just 1 to 1.5% in 2025, a sharp fall from the 4+% war boom that was seen in 23 to 24. This is classic credit crunch maths. Expensive money plus slowing growth plus rising bad loans plus sanctioned industries. And of course, that leads to banking fragility. Well, let's turn next to industries under strain, from factories to fuel and coal. There is a manufacturing recession going on in Russia. A report from the Russian Academy of Sciences Forecasting Institute, cited in multiple outlets, says that 18 out of 24 manufacturing sectors, almost 80% of all industrial output, are now in decline. Overall industrial growth has slowed to just 0.3% year on year, compared with 5.6% the year before. Reuters adds that Russia's industrial giants are responding by furloughing workers, cutting work weeks, and closing plants. Railways, mining, cement, coal, automotive, and metals are all affected. Companies like Russian Railways, Gaz, Kamaz, and Avtovaz have cut shifts or staff. A major plywood mill has shut down entirely. Diamond miner Alrosa is shrinking payrolls. Official unemployment stays low because people are pushed into low quality, low paid war work or informal jobs, and of course, many have been shunted off to the front lines where they have not come back. But underemployment and hidden job losses are spreading. The next topic is wage arrears and social stress. Medusa reports that wage arrears have quadrupled in a year, with workers across construction, mining, and even strategic defense plants going months without pay. One line from their piece says Russia is seeing a rapid rise in unpaid wages. Arrears have quadrupled in the last year. That's from Medusa. The Jamestown Foundation notes a growing wave of strikes and protests, including in sectors tied to the military. In Russia's Far East, local media described a dramatic protest where over 60 power plant workers owed wages for months, climbed onto a roof, and threatened to throw themselves off unless they were paid. That was reported in The Sun. Then there is the 2025 fuel crisis. Starting in August 2025, Ukrainian long-range drones launched a coordinated campaign against Russian oil refineries and export terminals. That's reported in Reuters. By mid-August, Reuters calculates the strikes had taken out about 17% of Russia's refining capacity. That is 1.2 million barrels per day, rising to 21% by the end of the month. A BBC Medusa Bellingcat-style open-source tally found that by autumn 21 out of Russia's 38 major refineries had been hit at least once. Inside Russia, this turned into the 2025 fuel crisis. Reuters reported that on some days refining output dropped by almost one-fifth and exports from key ports were slashed. Medusa published a photo essay titled Long Lines and Empty Pumps, Russia's Gasoline Crisis in Photos. It was showing queues, rationing, and closed gas stations. Well, we reported this at the time. Fuel shortages first hit Crimea and the Far East, but quickly spread into central regions, forcing emergency bans on gasoline exports and ad hoc price controls. Russia has used spare capacity and emergency repairs to keep headline refining output down, only about 3% year on year, but there's a catch. Revenues from this activity have cratered. That's according to Wikipedia. The International Energy Agency now says that Russia's oil and fuel export revenues in November 2025 fell to about $11 billion, the lowest level since the full-scale invasion began. Then there are losing sectors, such as coal. The FT reports that Russia's coal industry is going through its worst crisis in 30 years, losses of around 225 billion rubles so far this year, double last year's losses. At least 23 coal companies shut down, with another 50 plus at risk. Then there are logistics costs. Rail, ports eat up nearly 90% of the final sale price. That's according to the Financial Times. Coal does only account for less than 1% of total GDP, but it is regionally vital and shows a pattern. When global markets shift and sanctions bite, Moscow doesn't have the money to bail out every collapsing sector forever. Well, next there is the war machine that is eating the state from the inside out, with recruitment, conscription, and of course, empty wallets. Let's talk about the human pipeline feeding the war, because economics and manpower are now fusing in Putin's centralized state. Year-round conscription and an endless draft is hollowing out the workforce. From the 1st of January 2026, Russia abolishes the traditional spring an autumn draft. Instead, conscription will run all year round, with call-ups from 1st of January to 31st of December. This was formalised in laws signed by Putin and explained by outlets like lenta.ru, Kommersant and consultant.ru. These are all publications operating within the Russian ecosystem, we should point out. In parallel, the state is tightening mobilization rules, digitizing draft records and expanding the pool of reservists that it can tap. So even as the economy slows, more men are being pulled out of it, not into civilian jobs, but into the trenches, and for many, the inevitable fate that follows from that. Then the regions are running out of money for war bonuses. Again, we reported this in a recent episode. For 2 years, Russia used huge enlistment bonuses as a central recruitment tool. Some of the poorest regions offered extreme sums to sign up to the Russian army. In the small Volga Republic of Mariel, regional bonuses reached 2.6 million rubles per recruit early in 2026, but now the money is running out. Medusa reports that Saratov region, once a leader in spending on recruiters, has cancelled payments for recruiting contract soldiers and sharply cut lump sum payouts. Lenta and Ria showed the same trend in Saratov. A one-time bonus for signing a contract was slashed almost fivefold from 2.2 million rubles to 450,000. Euronews and Ukraine's intelligence service say more than 10 regions have reduced sign-up bonuses, citing lack of money and growing budget deficits. Over half of Russia's regions are now running substantial deficits. The Kremlin is doing two contradictory things at once, raising taxes and cutting social and regional spending to fund the war, but at the same time they are demanding more men and more loyalty from exactly those regions whose budgets it is bleeding dry. So what we see here is a bloated and yet brittle war economy. Milov and others emphasize that a huge chunk of Russia's GDP is now military related. Shells and missiles count as added value in the national accounts, but they don't build supply chains, exports, or technological upgrades. They just explode over Kharkiv, Donetsk, and other parts of Ukraine. The more Putin leans into war production, the more the civilian economy withers, and the tax base that funds the war production shrinks in turn. The Z patriots are starting to shout, stop. The UDF piece on Maxim Kalashnikov is striking precisely because he's not a liberal. He's an ultra-nationalist, a long-time advocate of Russian power and of the war itself. Yet he openly admits the original plan for a quick, victorious special operation has failed. He warns that continuing the war in 2026 risks economic collapse and the fall of the political and military system. He attacks those who say just print money and tighten the screws, warning of hyperinflation and a breakdown of army supply chains if the regime goes down that route. And he concedes that the Russian army simply cannot wage a modern high-tech war compared to its style of World War I, fighting that, the Russo-Japanese War, rather than the US-style campaigns in 91 and 2003, high-tech wars with extremely sophisticated logistics supply lines. Meanwhile, Michael Naki notes that industrialists, farm bosses, and Z war correspondents are panicking about bursting bubbles in multiple sectors, overstretched credit, phantom profits, and the fear that a single shock, whether it be new sanctions or an oil price drop or a banking panic, or all of them together, will trigger simultaneous crashes in several war-dependent industries. And this is one of the reasons why 2026 is being pointed to by many of these regime-aligned economists as a cliff edge year. By 2026, several trends converge. One is the persistent budget deficits with nearly depleted reserves in a country that cannot borrow abroad and struggles to borrow at home without crippling interest costs. Two is the tax shock, with the VAT hikes, new levies on small businesses and electronics, punitive taxes on foreign agents that hit consumption and investment. And three is a banking system where bad loans are piling up, and a Kremlin adjacent think tank is openly talking about a realistic risk of systemic crisis by late 2026. Fourthly, an industrial base in which 80% of manufacturing sectors are in recession, wage arrears are soaring, and major firms in metals, coal, autos, and rail are furloughing workers en masse. And fifth, a fuel system under constant attack from Ukrainian drones, cutting export revenues to the lowest point since 2022 and triggering domestic fuel crises that the Kremlin can only mask with bans and subsidies. And finally, six, a war machine that demands year-round conscription and hundreds of thousands of new recruits, just as regional budgets are running out of cash to pay them and are clawing back bonuses and benefits. But the Kremlin still has some levers to delay the crisis or to lessen its impact. It can tighten repression. It can seize corporate assets. It can force banks to roll over bad debts. And it can ban protest. It can also potentially turn a blind eye or suppress the debts or forgive the debts of these local regions that are running out of cash. It can, of course, devalue the ruble as well, inflate away part of the debt, and squeeze more, even more, from exporters, though that does risk strangling the economy. It can try to cut deals with some sanctioned states or exploit political chaos in the West. These are all options that will potentially defer the crisis, but everyone is in agreement that it can not prevent it permanently. 2026 is best understood not as an automatic game over, but as the point where the cost of continuing the war explodes for Putin economically, potentially socially, and politically. Well, we know that the Russian system is infamously apolitical, and fear will keep many people from criticizing. Nonetheless, these problems are mounting up. So what does this mean for Ukraine and the West? Well, for Ukraine and its allies, there are two temptations to avoid. One is complacency, assuming that the Russian economy will collapse anyway and using that as an excuse to slow support. That is a move that will cost many Ukrainian lives, which means we need to push harder and harder and harder on the Russian economy, using all the levers at our disposal. The second danger is appeasement, assuming that if we ease sanctions a little, Putin will choose peace over regime survival. This is a real danger. We see signs that Trump in the US is contemplating some of these moves, lessening the pressure on the Russian economy. That will only persuade Putin that he can continue to fight on. The evidence, of course, points the other way. The war is already a fiscal and structural disaster for Russia, but the regime is willing to sacrifice prosperity, regions, and even part of the banking system to keep the war going. The Z patriots are not demanding a democratic peace. Many want a freeze to the war simply so that they can rearm for the next round of aggression against Ukraine and potentially Europe as well. The strategic task for Ukraine and the democratic world is not to wait for the collapse of the Russian economy, but to turn the war into an ever more expensive trap for Putin's regime. That is to accelerate the pressure and try and force that economic collapse in Russia faster and sooner. Many of you generously contributed to buying a truck, a 4x4 vehicle for the armed forces of Ukraine in our recent marathon fundraiser for Car for Ukraine. That vehicle was delivered thanks to your generosity and refitted in Lviv with life-saving reinforcements, the doors, windows, and the engine area. That vehicle was destroyed a few weeks after it was delivered at the front in a drone attack. All three servicemen survived with only minor scratches and concussion. Your generosity in funding the vehicle was instrumental in saving the lives of all three Ukrainian soldiers. Now we are launching our Christmas Tree Trucks 2025 campaign. The goal is to raise €11,000. So please help us buy another vehicle for one of the most effective Ukrainian brigades on the fourth Christmas of Ukraine's epic fight for survival against an imperialistic and genocidal neighbouring state. Help us celebrate the heroism of the soldiers who have held the line against all the odds, who fight for their freedom and pay a terrible price, while also, incidentally, protecting the freedoms of Europe.